Thanks very much, everyone. So I think my direction is going to be quite a bit different. So I think this is going to be a nice two lectures that go together. I'm really at heart a kind of political philosopher. My early training was in philosophy. And so what I'm going to do here is do something that's quite conceptual, quite theoretical, really about philosophy. And I think what I really want to do here is push what has become the energy humanities beyond where I think it has settled, which is something like various disciplines in the humanities making use of energy as a subject. Some of us who are working in energy humanities realize we never really laid out the stakes of what it is that we wanted to do. And so I thought that that's what I would do here today for you. I hope too, for people that aren't interested necessarily in the energy humanities, that a lot of what I'm going to say here today will raise some essential questions, both about the kind of work that one might do in the environmental humanities quite broadly, but also really about essential political questions that we need to ask about the environment. There are lots of studies now of the environment. There's all of us here collected in the environment. There's centers of environmental studies. And some of what I want to say here today is kind of a question about, or I think it should raise some questions about really what's at stake in that kind of work. So without further ado, I'll just jump in. What's truly at stake in the energy humanities is the need to remap everything with an awareness of the enormous import of energy in mind. Modernity, as we have known it, would not have been possible without the energy of fossil fuels. The subject, as we have come to understand it, is one that cannot be fully thought without accounting for the expanded powers and sensibilities fossil fuels in particular have afforded it. The modern state as well, and its extended military and surveillance systems, and yes, I know I'm speaking here in Finland, so I'll say its welfare and social mechanisms too. These have to be reimagined in relation to the capacities afforded to it, specifically by fossil fuels. So the following 8 principles for a critical theory of energy that I'm going to offer here today, they're really meant to help fully initiate the project of energy humanities by gathering some sites, concepts, and common cause to enable and enact where I'm going to end, which is decarbonization, decolonialization, and decapitalization. Now, a critical theory of energy, like a critical theory of anything, it needs to work fundamentally in the service of emancipating social life from all of the impediments to being otherwise, and in this case, to the impediments of being otherwise in relationship to energy, of defining a different rhythm to what could come next in light of how we got here, and of unsettling the given that got us into this mess. Many have a feel for the way that oil and its entanglement with colonialism, capitalism, political impasse, the brutality of soft coercion, and all the measures of violence generates a kind of tension in the reproduction of daily life that cannot be addressed adequately by any immediate form of action. I feel it too. My aim here is to name some of the terms around which this feeling and the desire for new modes of energy life crystallize into points of potential contest. Wanting to care differently for each other and for a world far stranger and infinitely more beautiful than the one that has been figured by petroculture means applying pressure to some terms, opening them up for critical inspection. In the end, a critical theory of energy has to contend with the colonial extractivist history of energy around whose indifferent forces global capitalism has been developed. Our sense of futurity has to escape the conceptual grasp of a fossil fuel energetics, whose operations have ferociously divided the planet into have and have-nots, and whose continued operations are now producing a world emptied of possibility, not just for the many, but for everyone. So here goes, 8 principles. There's more in the final version of this essay, but there's only 8 principles that can fit in the time available. So. All right. Capitalism and modernity are why energy matters. Why is it important to theorize energy at all? The basic reason is twofold. First, because we have still not sufficiently attended to the role of oil in shaping social life on the planet, shaping it in vastly differentiated and unequal ways that broadly mirror the history of global power and privilege. Because we haven't engaged in this kind of theorization, we're missing a key component of the narrative of modernity, including the processes by which power was organized. Moreover, the energy source around which we have shaped physical infrastructures and economies, and equally individual affect and narratives of social being and belonging, it's one that can no longer be used. Or rather, given its environmental consequences, it should no longer be used to generate energy and all other manner of goods such as plastics and fertilizers. In hindsight, we know that fossil fuels should never have been used. 100 million barrels of oil burned in 2018 is 100 million barrels too much. 99 million barrels of oil burned in 2017 is 99 million too much. 98 million, you get the idea. I could do the rest of the paper doing this. Understanding the role of oil in modernity is essential to ending the use of oil in modernity. It's how the ethical imperative contained in, and so often contained by, the verb should with respect to action concerning the environment might be mobilized to generate a politics genuinely alert to global warming. Changing the environment or changing the contours of all societies on the planet in order to attend to global warming is a difficult task. One of the reasons I think those of us who have done this thing called energy humanities is because changing an energy source, by contrast to focusing on the environment, this kind of big other, is actually a distinct and legible political act. Second basic reason why it's important to theorize energy. While capitalism and the fossil fuels and energy in general cannot be reduced to one another, they are nevertheless involved in a complex relationship of mutual dependence. The availability of oil as of the middle of the 19th century has animated a more intensive and globally extensive capitalism. In turn, capitalism has thrived on the substance, demanding ever more of it. Crises of capitalism are strongly linked to oil, including the 2008 financial crash, in advance of which oil reached its historic its historic peak in price per barrel. The post-1989 period, in which processes of neoliberal governance reshaped practices of governmentality and the production, depended heavily on the use of oil, for instance, to fuel global production chains. In his recent book, The Uninhabitable Earth, David Wallace Wells notes that, quote, more than half of the carbon exhaled into the atmosphere by the burning of fossil fuels has been emitted in just the past 3 decades, end quote. Post-1989, capitalism has turned up the heat on the planet, so it's easy enough to say that capitalism has to go. But how to run the planet differently demands that we grapple with how to fuel it as well. Discursively, there appears to be no shortage of shared agreement that the dominant energy system of the present needs to change. Materially, however, we could not be further from anything other than another petrocultural century, this time perhaps longer and more straining than the last. So you've noticed that I've been talking about oil and not energy in general, and it's because of the second point, I think, which is that oil is hegemonic, or the infrastructural sublime. Oil is not the only energy source being used on the planet, but it remains the planet's dominant source of energy. Even if it were not the case that oil was dominant in sheer numbers, it still has to be understood as hegemonic. The reason why I, in my work, most often speak, and will speak here, about oil instead of energy in general. The practices of everyday life and the physical infrastructures of modernity have long been organized in relationship to oil. Strip malls and suburbs have little to do with nuclear power. The organization of production in relationship to global shipping and free trade zones owes nothing to wind or solar power. The sense and sensibilities of what it is to be modern and the role that energy plays in it is structured by oil. Lots of power generated by a small amount of the stuff. To many, the electric car might suggest the first steps in upending the hegemony of oil. To me, it simply confirms the degree to which oil remains hegemonic in shaping the imaginaries and sensibilities of the social, whether or not we continue to use it to power our lives. Even if we want to give it up, we still can't imagine giving up the mechanical beasts birthed by oil, nor the mobility and autonomy something like a car affords. Even as the use of oil and coal declines and actually natural gas increases at the moment, it's this hegemony of oil that needs to be contested and overturned. And it's a hegemony that could persist even when very little of the actual substance continues to be burned. Overturning oil's hegemony means first looking for the crude materials that ground its earthly operations. If oil is hegemonic, it is because it has engendered a topography and typology of infrastructure for well over a century, so much so that its infrastructures now double as social infrastructures, a veritable sublime that is both present to the subject it habituates and forever receding into spaces made deliberately invisible by private and state interest. Sometimes I'm asked, why devote, again, so much time to oil? Why oil and not other forms of energy? The hegemony of oil, to me at least, makes this abundantly clear. Oil is the substance with which one has to tarry politically. Burning oil produces global warming. It also produces the lived reality of petrocultures, which demands a more substantive response to its operations than hoping that we might keep the life worlds of oil running on cleaner stuff. Point 3, principle 3, we're all petro subjects now. This is, I think, a point that we do not take seriously enough, and I'm going to insist on it here, and you can see. Oil has given shape and form to human bodies. It has also had a determinate impact on the character of subjectivity. Movement through a world in which energy is largely confined to the body and mainly generated by it is distinct from the ways in which one inhabits a body in an era overflowing with energy. The transition from a world organized around the flow of solar energy, earlier solar energy, the base capacities of human and animal bodies, for instance, the transition from that world to one reliant on the energies of fossil fuels, that transition brought with it the reconfiguration of time and space that so many thinkers have noted as a defining aspect of modernity. The transition away from fossil fuels will demand the development of new relations to time and space. Not a return to what once was, but time and space reimagined in the wake of the experience of the expanded, extended selves of fossil fuel modernity. I'm going to give some kind of context to it. Exactly how has the body and subjectivity been shaped by oil and by expanded use of energy more generally? In Civilization and Its Discontents, Sigmund Freud describes the process through which humans have transformed themselves, in his words, into a kind of prosthetic god. He describes the multiple media and technologies through which humans have massively expanded the powers of their organs. He writes, and this is in Civilization and Its Discontents in 1930, motor power places gigantic forces at his disposal, which, like his muscles, he can employ in any direction. Thanks to ships and aircraft, neither water nor air can hinder his movements. By means of spectacles, he corrects deficits in the lenses of his own eye. By means of the telescope, he sees into the far distance, and by means of the microscope, he overcomes the limit of visibility set by the structure of his retina. In the photographic camera, he has created an instrument which retains the fleeting visual impressions, just as a gramophone disc retains the equally fleeting auditory ones. Both are at the bottom materializations of the power he possesses of recollection, his memory. With the help of the telephone, he can hear at distances which would be respected as unattainable even in a fairy tale. Writing was in its origin the voice of an absent person, and the dwelling house was a substitute for the mother's womb, the first lodging, for which, in all likelihood, man still longs. Of course, it's Freud here, and in which he felt safe and was at ease. It's the stuff of fairy tales. Maybe I should go back. This enormously expanded terrain of humanity's aesthesis and memory media. The subject of modernity presupposes communication technologies, senses intermediated by combustion, and all the rest of the apparatuses of the gigantic forces listed above. So much so that the prosthetic named here as an overextended body converts the force of fossil fuel techne into the formal arrangement of the body and place. Subject formation amidst these mediated extensions into a world means that fossil fuels condition the subject's naturalized experience of sensoria, not because any one individual suddenly gains the capacity to globally think, feel, act, and buy, but because the apparatus of energy becomes sedimented into the sensoria in which the subject feels out the world both directly and indirectly. Indeed, Freud suggests that humans had come close to attaining, as of 1930 at least, all the ideals they had in their stories projected onto gods, which is to say that the levels of energy used in Western countries today, some almost 100 years later, make its citizens something more than gods, creatures with powers greater than they could even have imagined. Oil is thus a prosthesis for the imagination, firing it up and allowing it to expand beyond the originary limits established by psychology and neurology. The discontents in the title of Freud's book name the mismatch between the powers of the prosthetic and the limits of the flesh. Despite finding themselves to be what I've described here as gods, humans, and these are Freud's words, quote, do not feel happy in their godlike character. The theme of slow bodies, brains, and sensibilities in an era of speed and the ability to access spaces well beyond immediate experience is a familiar one in narratives of modernity, stretching from Walter Benjamin to Reinhard Koselleck, and more recently from Jonathan Crary to Andreas Malm. The crisis and confusion of modern abstraction and acceleration need not be essentialist. That is, the body as limit needn't be figured as organic matter, simply unable to adapt to the time and space of modernity, which is what Freud seems to do here in his critique of this becoming godlike. Critics also point to the limits of the historical subject in understanding itself in relationship to the scale of modernity, a subject that cannot help but lose track of the ends to which its activity is directed and which is absorbed by social structures and infrastructures that appear to be driven by logics and imperatives autonomous from either individual or collective will. The external limit that modernity bumps up against can also be understood as the extra-human and the environment, both of which have appeared in discussions of crises and discontents in more recent critical analysis. Let me stay a bit more with Freud. His focus is on the technological apparatus of modernity rather than on the sources of energy that propel these. Never really talks about energy. By not including energy, though, as an account of the subject, what's missed are the character of the commitments made by emotive subjectivity to a whole way of being. When we're being asked, and we're being asked lately all the time, to undertake changes in the ways we live in order to limit our impact on the planet, the demand is not to stop using specific technologies, whether they're telescopes or microscopes or record players. Rather, the demand being made is to power down the energies that fuel the entire system of prostheses. The fear of each of us having less energy, which has impeded environmental transformation at the scale or speed required, is the expression of a prosthetic being that has come to take for granted the gigantic forces available to it. And it makes sense that this being should have this fear. Petro-subjects inhabit a petroculture of quickened time and expanded space that requires energy and oil to make it flow. And that flow feels awfully good for the most part. Or if not good, then certainly like the given. Perhaps we ought to worry more about feeling less good, about feeling dislodged from this given. Doing so might feel bad, but at least it would help unsettle the givenness of the good, and hence the petrocultural conditions of a fully naturalized world, and in Freud's term, seen and heard too, felt and seen and heard too in the image of oil. If we understand modernity then as a petromodernity, the political and conceptual challenges aren't to figure out whether it's possible to keep up with the speed of things, a speed that we have to also remember is inevitably connected to the extraction of value and labor. The task, a difficult one, is to think about how to convince a planet of demigods and gods, and creatures perhaps now even greater than gods, that they want to be mortals. And specific kinds of mortals, ones who know the attractions and powers of once having been deities. A difficult task, especially when all around them the vast infrastructure of petromodernity will act as a constant reminder of the pleasure and powers they once had. Oil is not a thing, but a social relation. To say that energy is a social relation implies already that a politics organized from the idea of switching from one source to another, oil to solar, say, without altering the activities and social forms that make energy possible, is either fetishistic or reactionary. But let's take a step back. What does it even mean to call something a social relation? And why is this admittedly vague claim so important to so many critical theories of capitalism? Implicit in the claim that energy is a social relation is that value is tied to energy at the site of production and to the energy system more generally across sites of social reproduction. Kind of going back to classic figures here, as one does when one announces principles. So let me talk about Marx. Marx's name for tying the system, the site of production and the site of social reproduction together is, of course, the relations of production, which is distinct from the forces of production, which is where we might have expected Marx to talk about energy. After naming surplus value a social relation, Marx forecasts an explosive contradiction between the forces and relations of production. Read back through Marx's critique of positivism in economic thinking, energy is both the condition of possibility during a certain phase of development and the fetters for future development at a certain point of concentration, saturation, and exhaustion. So both there's a kind of a possibility emerged by energy in terms of development, and it's the fetters. It makes it difficult to develop further. And I'm going to explain why in a minute. Plainly, this is the world we live in, a world soaked in contradiction and threatened by mass ecological catastrophe, but nudged hardly a wink in the direction of social revolution or fundamental transition. My claim here, this principle of oil being an energy, a social relation, is that the political economy of energy right now is not yet isolated from the natural environment from which it comes in the progressive positions that claim energy as the crux of climate change. This, of course, does not mean that a critical theory of energy needs to bracket the environment and materiality of a world rapidly warming, but that the compulsions of fossil fuel capitalism keep flooding forward according to the availability and feasibility of surplus value, a calculus of and mode of representing value completely inoculated against one that might be more attuned to ecological entanglement. In a strong sense, the turn to what my colleague Stacy Alaimo terms transcorporeality in the social sciences and the humanities, it ought to form the praxis of relation dislodged from capitalism. But the compulsions of capital appear to need more than a coming to ecological consciousness on the side of the relations of production to disarticulate accumulation from more and more resources. One way or another, the tension will need to be lodged between the relations and forces of production. Real estate and the rights of energy. Principle 5. The opening scene of Upton Sinclair's Oil is a flurry of activity. Cars fly across the landscape, public assemblies collect the body politic, and the prospect of oil litters the prose with a kinetic frenzy. Someone is about to hit pay dirt. The only thing getting in the way is property. Energy cannot be understood outside the frame of property, and it's hard to imagine anything approaching a true change in energy without the oldest of revolutionary transformations, the return of property to the common. The law of property has sustained fossil fuel modernity, whether because sovereign governments have a control over a resource that generates income on which they depend, or because property owners spend resource dollars on political candidates that will allow extraction to continue. One of the real limits when it comes to imagining life beyond fossil fuels is the inability to connect transitions to renewable forms of energy with a much more significant transition, which is a transition away from property. Renewable forms of energy are structured as forms of property, and as property, the desire to extract profit from energy remains, as does the desire of property owners to extract as much profit as possible from their property. Remember, for those of you who might have seen it, in Jean-Pierre and Luc Dardin's film 2 Days, 1 Night, The fact that the site of work is a solar panel factory seems to matter not in the least for the workers employed there. They are as precarious as workers anywhere, and the property owners are the ones who profit through their labor. Principle 6, there's never been an energy democracy. At no point in the history of fossil fuels has its use ever been subject to democratic oversight and control. This is plainly true in the case of the industrial oil giants that have to be counted amongst the handful of largest corporations to ever roam the earth. Even at a moment when there's incredibly intense interest in tech companies such as Amazon, Google, and so on, if you look at the companies with largest revenues, they are still very, very old ones. Things like BP, ExxonMobil, Shell, Total, and so on. In fact, those 4 companies that I've just mentioned in 2017, they totaled almost $1 trillion in revenue, and it was actually an off year. These corporations extract oil wherever they can, deep in the ground using chemical solvents to help with the task, or deep in the ocean despite the very real dangers for the crews involved and the ocean surrounding the rigs. As private corporations operating in a neoliberal world, they're responsible only to their shareholders and have increasingly less public oversight of their decisions and actions. In the United States, oil companies have used their considerable wealth to make sure that political decision-making favors them. So in 2017, for instance, a Trump government tax cut quintupled ExxonMobil's profit that year, quarterly profit. And just in Canada, my own home country, Conservative Party leader Andrew Scheer participated in a day-long strategy meeting with oil executives immediately following the announcement of the federal election, which happened recently. The environmental and economic implications of unfettered energy use demand that energy become subject to true democratic oversight. But there's a corollary insight that arises from the insistence here that energy be managed democratically. However we might theorize, this is the corollary, however we might theorize the democracies of the future, the role and function of energy needs to be foregrounded in their figuration. As in almost every other sphere of analysis, there's a problematic lack of attention to energy in most elaborations or speculations of the political future. Socio-political ideas and ideals from Rousseau through to autonomism, and likely before and after, have rarely attended to the material demands and environmental impacts of political forms and structures. The primary issue in political theory has been who controls what and why, not whether there's actually enough to go around or if particular forms of governance or ownership threaten the very possibility of a political future due to the demands they place on the environment. If machines are supposed to set us free from work, as might be described in autonomism or other kinds of current philosophy, and is the appeal to, and these philosophies often appeal to that little bit of Karl Marx's fragment on machines in Grundrisse. If machines are supposed to set us free from work, what is it that the machines will run on after all? And what are the environmental and political consequences of using the fuels that make it all work? While it might have once been possible to imagine that Earth is constituting a resource bounty, and I think most political philosophies have imagined that and continue to imagine that, a resource bounty that at some point could be made accessible to all political subjects, in the wake of the post-World War II acceleration of energy use and pollution and population as well, is simply no longer feasible to articulate a common that does not attend to resources and the environmental consequences of their use. Energy needs to be the focus of any future common, which Pierre Dardot and Christian Laval, the French philosophers, have described straightforwardly. What a common is as, quote, in the most systematic and profound manner possible, the widespread introduction of institutional self-government, end quote. Every common to come will need to be imagined not just as an open political horizon, but also in relation to limits, perhaps especially in relation to energy resources. In the past, when the question of limits has been introduced as an aspect of political discourse, it has generally been seen as a reactionary gesture designed to impede political change, as opposed to a genuine attempt to attune the political to restrictions, whether social or environmental ones. For instance, Malthusian anxieties about the population have long been been seen as a touchstone in that respect. The kind of limit of population being a reactionary gesture when you try to introduce the idea of limit to political change. But there are things we can learn from limits. In an era in which we now we have to assess environmental and social possibilities in the language of parts per million of carbon dioxide, older commitments to the common might no longer be the ones we want or need. Energy needs to be governed democratically. And I would say even those countries that have public energy companies, it is not governed especially democratically. In part because this conception of the democratic itself needs to be framed in relation to energy in the deepest way possible. Extractivism buries as much as it digs up. Extractivism names a given economic form of organizing natural and social resources in which sustained profitability depends on the extraction over time of an increasing amount of natural resources from the earth. Between 1870 and 2009, roughly 135 billion tons of oil were extracted and unleashed into the global economy. As of December 31st of 2014, an estimated 1,237 billion short tons of proven recoverable coal has been tagged for future extraction. Extractivism is the name for an activism. It generates rather obvious environmental challenges. In what is commonly known as the immiseration thesis, Marx reveals the twofold forms of energy that capital will acquire over time. First, as capital accumulates in larger quantities, reflected in the scale of operations, gross output, and relative command of individual firms and entire sectors, its need for less and less human labor time per unit of output generates a tendency toward contradiction. That contradiction is spelled out further in the Marx calls the absolute general law of capital's accumulation, which is the fateful fall in the rate of profit as capital's accumulation reaches its zenith, even if this zenith is cyclical rather than terminal. So we have this play out. More and more wealth accumulates in fewer and fewer hands, while more and more labor is subsumed into the economic process or suddenly shed from the production process, causing rolling and irreversible waves of unemployment. Sounds very similar to the period we're living through. So this is the first valence of energy used by Marx, ever-expanding stages of growth met by ever-intensive forms of secular stagnation. The second valence is more literal. Capital in its constant form, that is, the machines, buildings, hardware, all of the physical apparatus and infrastructure around us, of which capital employs as its own part of the bargain, is both ever-growing in magnitude and value relative to the variable form of capital, and, as a logical consequence, animated by more and more energy over time relative to the quantitative energy of human input. Basically, this is to say that you have lots of stuff all over the planet, more than before, more and more, always before, all of it needs to be powered. What Marx calls the general law of capital's accumulation is thus about a historical trajectory to accumulation, and at the same time, it is about an environmental relation. More and more resources will be needed from the Earth's subsurface to fuel the rising magnitude of capital's constant forms, its machines, buildings, hardware, and so on. Of course, there's moments when capital appears to need fewer resources, or when it suddenly appears to do more with less. But this doesn't contradict the historical arc of the general law. They confirm it. Cutting costs is the sine qua non of capital as a logic, and so individual firms and sectors naturally find cheaper and more efficient forms of energy as others become costlier. Yet the relative cheapness of a given form of energy becomes immediately compromised once it's no longer emergent, but is instead dominant. Hence, cheap oil is largely credited for the golden era of US hegemony from the early 1950s through the late 1960s, while cheap coal is understood to have provided the physical and economic conditions for large-scale industrialization in England and then Germany and France in the early to mid-19th century. Flipped around, however, the same is true of the expensive oil that characterized the post-1970s era, vividly expressed in the floating average of over $100 US per barrel between 2000 and 2008. Not coincidentally, this is the era of what Neil Brenner has influentially termed the long downturn, when the rate of profit began its steady fall towards negligible rates that mark the long present. Capital will always be an extractivist mode of social organization, not despite, but because of its intransigent drive to cut costs. Using more and more physical energy from fossil fuels is a form of cutting labor costs, until it's not. When the cost of energy rises to the level of constraint, capital seeks out either new sources of energy or innovative ways to extract what's left. That is to say, energy in the form of fossil fuels has typically been a very cost-effective means to economize and minimize human labor power. And when specific forms of extracting fossil fuels become too costly, some other form is usually right over the horizon. All of the lauded renewable forms that we hear talk about all the time. Final principle. And I think if you listen carefully, most of what I've been talking here about is about infrastructure and the demands that it places on politics and the necessity to think about infrastructure in any kind of politics that we might want to imagine. So where do these principles bring us? I said at the outset that I want to kind of describe a critical theory of energy, and perhaps what we should end with is what are the politics that arise out of this critical theory. If we're serious about transitioning to a renewable and equitable relation to energy, and by extension, serious too about reshaping the social relations recursive to the form of extraction, circulation, and consumption that underwrite that relation to energy, we have no choice but to focalize our critiques, attachments, and desires through the infrastructural. There's a reason why references to infrastructure haunt every one of the principles that I've outlined here. But I want to be clear before I say anything more that this insistence on infrastructure is the opposite of saying that, in older language, that the base trumps superstructure, or saying that so many cultural and ideological expressions amount to a veil draped over the real material conditions that shape our continued pull through the otherwise obfuscated and obstinate logic of fossil fuel capitalism. No doubt, there's more than enough ideological and cultural delusion to go around. But unveiling is not what making infrastructure primary to a praxis of sociological and ecological justice opens up. Unveiling presupposes that seeing things for what they are, as opposed to what they appear to be, disposes with the sedimentation of material and discursive histories in bodies and landscape, a debunking rather than a sifting through. A critical theory attentive to the historicity and materiality of energy sifts through infrastructure because it is there that where one encounters the dusty, bloody, and sedimented archive of capitalism's longue durée over the bodies and resources of the planet. The critique of energy infrastructure makes available a presentism that refuses the terms of the present. Epochal shifts have been dug into the depths of the earth on the back of capitalism's drives and liberalism's attendant form of reason. Entire geographies, cultures, and relations to the earth have been upended, eviscerated, or shackled to the tides of a history written in the language of infrastructure. Plainly, we ought to be deeply critical of the ongoing violence that grids infrastructure in the present and the future. But a critique of infrastructure also needs to be an infrastructuralism of critique, not more of the same, which are perhaps self-satisfying claims regarding civil engineering's racism or investors who talk like Descartes, but a materialism both new and historical, intimate to what makes infrastructure dizzying and dazzling. So I've been arguing here, perhaps very quickly, perhaps with too much density, that a critical theory of energy, like a critical theory of anything, is critical in the measure that it labors in the service of emancipation from that which we may not even fully recognize or desire or need to be emancipated from. But the conceptual scaling of energy from the historical to the experiential, from the geological to the ecological, from the aesthesis of everyday life to the aesthetics of capital's reason and rampage over the Earth's human and non-human resources, means that what is at stake in a critical theory attuned to energy is effervescent. This is a critical theory fundamental to the Venn diagramming of concerns animating so much of radical political thought today. In my account, these spheres of the diagram conjoin around three critical concerns that matter I think, deeply to the shape of things to come. Decarbonization, decapitalization, and decolonialization. Making infrastructure primary means taking seriously the forms of experience, extension, and enmity that knot bodies past and present, and future too, to the habits and habitats formed by cables, ports, pipelines, roads, and refineries, but political and economic structures as well, as I've been discussing here, the apparatus of property, the apparatus of the nation state, the apparatus of labor, the apparatus of democracy. Taking these forms seriously means tracking them, looking at them with bifocals, and eventually finding pressure points that allow us and those to whom we ally ourselves strategic points of theoretical and material intervention. It means listening to those that know firsthand what infrastructural expansion means, when the very grounds for a life lived get chewed up and fenced off. But it also means learning what hurts those that want to dig deeper into the earth. Every pipeline blocked and every freeway called into question obstructs and challenges more than the pipeline, and more than that pipeline and that freeway. Infrastructure is invariably necessary, but we know in the humanities and social sciences painfully well that the realization and naturalization of the necessary is always the expression of a strained and traumatic duration to social politics, discursively forgotten once the ground is broken for construction. Fossil fuels are certainly not going anywhere anytime soon. If any of the projections made by the International Energy Association or the US Energy Information Association or by any of the futures studies groups or any of the scenario planning groups that I know of. Because in truth, they're both socially and materially intertwined with the most basic forms of freedom, mobility, and care that we take as necessary, as the given. The point is not to turn off the switch in order to prevent the delivery of plastic prostheses, the function of coal-powered hospitals, and the diesel-fueled containers from reaching port in places hungry for its content, which isn't the same as saying the rhetoric of keep it in the ground is unimportant or ineffectual. Critical theory is about generating a long view of the given. It is a means of denting the soft and quiet violences and the loud and hard ones as well, of the infrastructures laced through landscape and the displacements, genocides, and environmental racisms that it both historically and presently reproduces. If we're serious about transition, and I suppose that's what I've been talking about here, if we're serious about energy transition, we need another transition, and that's a transition to an otherwise of the given. I hope that the principles outlined here can help make some of that happen. Thanks.